All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm very excited to talk with you all about the role of climate change and its increasing relevance to the topic of sexual and reproductive health, and the work that Say What is doing to sort of mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change in the topic of sexual and reproductive health. And with us today, we have 4 interns currently working for Say What, who are very excited to share their own perspectives on the topic. We have all been researching and writing some articles relating to the topic, and it's going to be interesting today to sort of discuss that among ourselves and to just get different perspectives on the role that NGOs have to work with climate change and to combat its effects. So to start, I would want to invite maybe Maria, would you like to share what did you write on for your article? What did you find? And any insights or opinions that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, so I basically looked into my first topic was the role of young people in climate change adaptation and mitigation in the SADC region, so the Southern African Development Community region. And I basically looked into how young people are being encouraged through projects and incentivized kind of volunteerism projects. And then also what are the big obstacles that they face in terms of, we all know that obviously Africa is one of the countries with one of the highest rates of poverty. And so how do these kind of affect their ability to advocate and to be engaged in these types of, community engagement. And then I also looked into, I'll read out my research question for the second one. In what ways can international climate policies and agreements be restructured to better address the needs and concerns of global South countries and promote equitable and just climate action? So within this other question, I kind of looked into the more legislative element here, and I saw that actually, again, because of the structural inequalities that are present in the global South, it's a lot harder for these these countries to overcome such obstacles such as the climate crisis. Also, I looked into the term of climate colonialism, which is basically how they've been kind of exploited, and how, as a result, again, this leads to some structural differences that are really hard to overcome. And so, I kind of looked into this. It's very intersectional, I think, the way that I answered these questions. And it all, again, goes back to the fact that in order to kind of solve the climate issue and how to raise awareness to this, we have to see it from a very holistic point of view, and we have to involve the youth, and we have to involve all of the different sectors, like the agricultural one, the infrastructure, everything that's being kind of affected by this poverty and these inequalities.
Interesting, yeah. So then you also take a more historical and just a political, socioeconomic perspective on the issue of climate change. Yeah, really interesting. And what was maybe one thing that surprised you when you were researching your article, or something that you hadn't thought about before, that you, through looking at the topic of specifically sexual and reproductive health, you were looking at differently than you had before?
Yeah, so one of the things was we all had to write feature articles at the very beginning of the course, and one of the feature article I wrote was about child abuse and how it's kind of facilitated and justified through the legislature. So in the Constitution, it's actually the definition of child makes it easier for the abuse and the violence to keep happening. And this is because it basically considers a child someone who is below the age of 16, as opposed to a lot of other policies that consider the definition of it being below the age of 18. And so as a result, kind of because he's like the figure is so young and it's considered at such a young age, it makes it a lot harder to be protected later on. So it makes it a lot harder for welfare to be applied to children in Africa just because of the actual definition that's being presented in the Constitution, which I thought was kind of surreal. And how this small thing then leads to so many bureaucratic but also structural differences and
right.
Yeah.
Right, because the legal then leaks into the cultural as well. As it's when you legally define a child from a certain age, then you also culturally will see a child as being defined from a certain age, and so it's very important to see those things as intertwined. Yeah, for sure. Mia, so you also wrote an article on climate change and sexual and reproductive health, and I think yours also very much commented on the link between the two. Would you want to explain a little more what you wrote and maybe something that you found interesting in doing your research for Say What?
Yeah, so in the first half of my article, I mainly explored how climate change disproportionately affects marginalized communities, and then also what can be done to kind of help that and mitigate that. So, for example, things like food and water insecurity, health impacts, displacement and forced migration, and sort of impacts from natural disasters always disproportionately affect marginalized communities like Indigenous people, low-income populations, racial and ethnic minorities, and also especially women. And then I kind of explored how to kind of help rectify this, so addressing it through kind of changing policies and kind of looking out for the marginalized groups as compared to historically where it's suppressed that. And then in the second half of my article, I led on to how this impacts sexual reproductive rights, to see kind of the impacts of that, because I also found this quite interesting, as previously I hadn't really thought of climate change's impacts on sexual reproductive rights. It wasn't really a link I had made that much before in my mind, before kind of exploring these topics. And then impacts can include like on maternal and child mortality, malnutrition, infectious diseases, all kind of from climate change, of how it impacts sexual reproductive health. And I looked at how to mitigate this, for example, through promoting comprehensive sexuality education and awareness programs from a young age, but also through just sort of university education and making programs like that more accessible. So education has really overall improved there.
Mm-hmm. And was there anything that you, aside from the link between sexual and reproductive health and climate change, which you obviously found unexpected, was there anything in the sort of approaches that NGOs can take, or the things that NGOs can do to combat this link? Was there anything there that you found interesting or you think would be effective for Say What to maybe also integrate into their strategies and their mission?
I think Say What's done actually a very good kind of job at doing this, because it seems that they don't just target sort of one demographic. They're very open to many sort of people coming in to look for help with them. Mm-hmm. So I thought they did a really good job on that.
Yeah, awesome. That's good to hear. That's really nice. And then, Bence, you also wrote an article on climate change and sexual and reproductive health. Could you tell us about the questions that you handled and sort of what you found?
Yeah, for sure. So my article focused for the main part on how climate change affects health, which was similar to me. It's also a link that I didn't know existed, especially that it existed so in such pronounced ways. So I explored a bit on all the different ways in which climate change can lead to health outcomes, most of the time adverse, so negative health outcomes. And they range from increased transmission rates for diseases because of changing local climates, and so mosquitoes, for example, are more prevalent in an area, and then malaria is transmission rates are increasing through maybe what's a bit more like obvious is like extreme weather events, floods, heat waves, tornadoes, and how they all can cause injuries to people. And then besides these, there's also a lot more indirect ways in which climate change can affect health, what I found. Amongst them are especially that is pronounced in the South African region is malnutrition, because climate change can greatly affect crop yields, which then put people at risk of malnutrition. So I discovered these questions a bit, and I also looked at how health systems can be strengthened to address all of these challenges. And basically, what the most important thing that seems to be is that vulnerable communities and marginalized communities need special attention and care, so that they are not going to be further marginalized, but that they can be integrated into society. And health systems, health infrastructure really needs a lot of support, because they are very important in tackling all the adverse health outcomes that climate change brings.
Yeah. No, that's really great. And did you also stumble across any strategies or sort of tools that Say What could perhaps use to lessen the effect of climate change on the health of the people in Zimbabwe?
I think in general, firstly, it's important to talk about these questions and to educate people and to make sure that the public is aware of the potential ways in which climate change can impact health. So I think that is of key importance, and Say What is already doing that. And then besides, it's also of key importance to involve policymakers in change and make sure that national budgets are distributed in ways that support and financial aid goes to the regions and the infrastructures that are the most affected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really good. I'll end with myself then before we move into the discussion part. I also wrote an article. I tackled the questions of how climate change impacts sexual health and sexual and reproductive health, and what strategies can be employed to mitigate these effects. And I also looked specifically at the role of young people in climate change adaptation and mitigation in the Southern African regions, and how NGOs like Say What can kind of encourage their participation and support the youth, which is obviously a big part of Say What's mission, is to make sure that they mobilize young people. Like Mia, like Bence, I was also just very surprised at the direct link between climate change and sexual and reproductive health. I hadn't really considered this before. Just the very direct image of how extreme drought can actually make it more difficult for women to go to school, because they spend more time having to get water and therefore are at higher risk of being exposed to sexual assault and to predatory behavior, when low economic situations due to humanitarian crises can actually make child marriages more common. All of these effects of just the link between the climate and humanitarian crises, which therefore have an impact on sexual and reproductive health, I hadn't considered yet. So that was very eye-opening for me to learn about this so directly, and I understand now why Say What is implementing so many measures to look and research into climate change and its effect on their mission. The last point that I had, which was very interesting, was looking at how youth can be involved. And for this, I used a model that's been promoted by the Global Center on Adaptation. And they had three kind of sorts of ways that youth can get involved, either through advocacy and education, which they call using technology and being mobilizers from technology, so youth can actually use things like social media to help promote the voices of people who are usually not heard and to amplify those. Next, the Global Center on Adaptation, they also use the phrase of bridge builders, because the youth have actually quite a important role to play between being the bridge between NGOs and the youth and the people on the ground, the communities who are actually suffering or who are struggling, and sort of working with the NGOs more directly. And there they also have a role to sort of amplify the voices of those who are struggling. And lastly, the Global Center on Adaptation also emphasized the role that youth have in being what they called community champions, who sort of makes sure that the community is heard, that the community is mobilized, also on a legal basis. I think we've seen what you were talking about as well, the intersection between the legal and the cultural parts of this issue. It's an incredibly interlinked, interdisciplinary and complex thing. And so for the youth to realize their role in standing in between and mitigating both the community and legal bodies such as governing organizations, but also like NGOs, it's very important. And I think Say What is doing a lot to mobilize youth and help them understand that their voice is being heard and that it's important. And that also when they are equipped with education and knowledge on how to protect their own health, how to protect their own culture, how to protect their own dignity, that will equip them to pass that knowledge on to the community and sort of help other people as well, and become future leaders in these fields. So yeah, I think we all have had very similar but also slightly different and nuanced essays or articles that talked about climate change and its effects on sexual and reproductive health, which we all sort of hadn't considered as actively before. So I'm just interested to know of if you could pick one thing that Say What can do that sort of reflects onto the topics that you discussed in your essay, that maybe Say What can learn from, or even that we can learn from. You know, we are sitting here in the Netherlands, we're sitting here in a place that will largely not be affected in the same way as Zimbabwe will be by climate change. You know, us in a point of privilege that we're in right now, what can we do, or what can Say What do to help combat some of the effects that you guys have talked about in your article? I see we only have 5 minutes left, so I just want to, if we can all briefly say something, that would be a really wonderful way to wrap up.
Yeah, I think, sorry to just grab the word. I think one of the things that I find the most important is the emphasis on the voice of the Global South, because there's also an article that I read, and it was like a meta-analysis of all the articles and researches that tackle the health effects of climate change, and the finding of this analysis was that the overwhelming majority was researches was carried out in the Global South, in North America or in Europe, and it was very it is just very improportionate, because these countries are not the ones who will be affected, and there was barely any sources from the Global South or international cooperation found. So I think what is of key importance is to emphasize the role and the voice of the Global South. And I think that's also something that Say What is working on intensely, but I also think it's very important for us, coming from a point of privilege in Europe, to work on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have any suggestions or things? Yeah, Maria.
One thing I saw there that was really interesting was that I kind of looked at different climate change or sustainability related projects that were being kind of encouraged. But actually, research has shown that some of the most empowering and some of the most important projects that mobilize others are volunteer projects, and that's because it's not financially remunerated. It's kind of just a volunteer act, so they're not forced to obviously work in these environments. But what it does is that it increases social capita, it increases social cohesion, and also tolerance, because groups are forced to work with other diverse communities. And so in general, the article that I read by Delaney says that in general it actually forces nation building. So I think that would be kind of an interesting approach that Say What, I'm sure I've seen that it also implements this, but kind of to keep in mind that it actually is a very effective way of mobilizing others to action.
Yeah, and also building that community and things as well. Yeah, for sure. Mia?
I just had a quick point of how the emphasis on how education is really key in this situation, in kind of all categories, all ages, but just Say What is doing it too, and I think they're really good at emphasizing, but really just knowledge about this topic is really important here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think knowledge is also it's such a powerful thing, right? Because it allows for the people who are going to be affected to pass on the knowledge to future generations who are going to be affected by it even more. And also for people to take power into their own hands, when there's extreme weather events and hospitals become less accessible, having knowledge of your own healthcare and how to take control of that is going to make you less dependent on infrastructures. It's going to make you more resilient in these climate crises events. So I think it's very important as we move into a climate changed world to focus extra on knowledge and education and make sure that that's also a cultural value. I think that makes sure that what you were saying, minorities don't have knowledge and education taken away from them when times get difficult, and that we understand culturally that knowledge is very important and should always be continued to be emphasized for young women, young girls, and minorities especially. So yeah, I think that's a really good summary. If anybody has anything else they'd like to say, please feel free to do that now. And if not, then I think this has been a really wonderful conversation. And yeah, I look forward to all the work that Say What is going to do in the area of climate change. And we hope this podcast has helped a little bit to create some new perspectives on some topics.
Yeah. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks.